The most interesting way to describe it, and I think for people to understand too, is as you alluded to before, from perceiving your muscles rather than just as muscles to pick up heavy stuff, but more as endocrine tissues. So they have these signaling molecules called myokines, and there's a variety of different things to communicate with your brain. So one of the biggest things that we see is elevations in the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And it's hard to say one-to-one that this is associated with the antidepressant effects, but we know that BDNF is also known as the miracle grow for the brain, and this is so important because depression is essentially an attack on your brain. So it's kind of counteracting that. So that's one of the mechanisms that has been shown in the literature to where exercise may have a benefit. And with that too, we know that exercise leads to structural sometimes changes in the brain too. So the hippocampus, or an area that's very important for memory, there's been associations with increased hippocampal volume following exercise, not acutely, like you wouldn't leave the gym with a massive hippocampus after one session, but over time. Yeah. And then some of the neurotransmitters that we talk about within psychiatry too with our medications, so serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, these neurotransmitters, we know over time exercise leads to elevations in them.
Dr. Nick Fabiano, depression is a really complicated topic to talk about because it's so different from one person to another. I mean, you are one of the leading experts in the metabolic realm of depression, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But I want to open this discussion with just like, what is depression? And then we will get into like practical lifestyle ways that are demonstrated in evidence to sort of mitigate some of these depressive tendencies. But in your words, like, what is depression? How is it different from person to person?
I put a link down below for 30% off all things from Thrive Market on your first order. Now, they're not just about snacks and pantry staples. They've got good, legit, high protein foods, which is how I live. Even my snacks are high protein. Thing is, if you go to a grocery store, the high protein snacks, they're kind of playing games with you. Like, they'll call it high protein, but you look at the ingredients and you realize that there's like some weird kind of like pea protein or something. Not that there's anything wrong with pea protein, but the reality is it's not what it seems on the surface, and it might only be 4 grams of protein. The thing I like about Thrive is you see what you get and you get what you see. It's transparent. So you can look at the ingredients and they're not gonna have garbage there and you're gonna be able to see it. And then it gets delivered right to your doorstep. So you're not having to spend time. Even myself, I know what to look for at a grocery store, but it takes me probably 25% longer to go grocery shopping than the average person because I do cross-reference everything that's in the ingredients. I don't like to bring that stuff into my house. Thrive Market takes that guesswork out of the equation for me, and it makes it accessible to me, but it makes it accessible to people all over the country. So that's what's really cool. So that link gets you 30% off your entire first grocery order and gets you a free $60 gift. Not to mention it gets delivered right to your doorstep, which is pretty darn cool, and their shipping is speedy, speedy fast. So that link down below.
Yeah, so traditionally we define depression using DSM criteria. That's the big book that we use as psychiatrists to diagnose all different mental disorders. So if we want to go by the textbook criteria, it's essentially having 5 out of 9 symptoms over a 2-week period that predominantly are related to low mood or that decrease of motivation. But you see other symptoms like concentration difficulties, low energy, changes in appetite, even thoughts of not wanting to be alive, among others. And the issue you run in there is that you have these symptom clusters, and you can imagine that there's a bunch of different ways to combine them. And depending on what book you use and different things, some people have estimated that there's about 60 million ways to have different combinations to be diagnosed with depression. With that, you can imagine
60 million?
60 million. Yeah. So, and I want to emphasize, we put that under one term, right? So the term depression, which many people have been diagnosed with, have been treated with antidepressants, it's under this one term. So we really need to highlight how different each person's presentation can be. So not only causative factors, but also the cluster of symptoms that they have. And within those symptoms, the severity of the symptoms can be different. You can imagine for someone with depression, someone's predominant symptoms may be just a very, very low mood. Someone else may have very prominent issues with sleep. Someone else may have very prominent issues with energy. And with that, it's no surprise that some of our treatments, when we only have a finite amount traditionally defined, like our antidepressants in therapy, don't necessarily work for everyone, which is why I think it's important to really talk to the person in front of you, see what symptoms are really prominent for them, and be able to come up with a plan that works best. So that may be a mix of antidepressants, therapy, exercise, creatine, stuff like that. But it's important to talk with them and understand what that depression means to them rather than just the label that they've received.
Yeah, because I mean, conventionally, I think at least in the mainstream, if you talk to just someone that you ask them what depression is, if they had any sort of knowledge of it, they might say, okay, well, it's low dopamine, or like you're kind of like looking at this one singular pathway. And I think what you're saying, I mean, there's just all these different compounding, different things that come into play. Are we seeing that like the brain is operating differently in these different people that are still classified with depression or diagnosed with depression? Like if you were to, I know we're lacking a lot of the imaging stuff, but with depression, there's probably still at least a lot available. Like if one person has depression and another person has depression, like if you look at them under, say, like fMRI, like are they two totally different things but still classified under depression?
Yeah, so across mental disorders, even beyond depression, if you were to scan the brains of many different people, so depression, someone experiencing psychosis, anxiety, you may see some similarities across them. But again, there's a lot of unique expressions of what depression may be. So with depression, whether it's imaging or blood tests, you may see levels of inflammation. One of the prominent theories before was the serotonin theory of depression, which essentially proposed that low serotonin was the cause of depression. We now know, at least within the academic community, that that's not necessarily the case, where low serotonin is causing the depression. It can be the result of, and you may see levels like that. And that's where the basis for like SSRI medications and everything came from, is repleting that serotonin. But it's much broader than that. There are brain changes such as atrophy in different regions, and depression is also a risk factor later in life for things like dementia, because you can see it as almost like an attack on the brain. But again, it's not this uniform attack where it's the same for everyone. It can be so different, and that can manifest in many different ways within the brain itself.
So you caught my attention with the inflammation piece, right? And that's like a great dovetail into sort of the metabolic discussion surrounding this. When you say, you have this neuroinflammation, you have and this could be in someone that doesn't particularly have like a high CRP level, right? Like they're not necessarily showing systemic or cardiac CRP being elevated. This is like localized in the brain?
Yeah, so it can be both. So sometimes it's useful to look at it in terms of what conditions people with depression have at the same time or at separate times. So we know conditions linked with inflammation like diabetes and different metabolic conditions. Bidirectionally, there's an association. So with that peripheral inflammation, there's an association with depression. But in the same way, too, people that have depression are at a higher risk of developing some of these metabolic conditions. So from that alone, we see the link both ways in depression and physical disorders. And it's tough to say what that's mediated by. There have been some theories to say that inflammation can be a causative factor. There's some theories to say, or studies to show that anti-inflammatory agents can be used to treat depression. However, the evidence is a little bit mixed there. It's not entirely a one-to-one association where adding an anti-inflammatory agent is going to cure or make stuff better. Some studies say yes, some studies say no. And I think that may go back to the original point that I had made, where maybe each person's depression is unique and different. So there may be subgroups where inflammation is more predominant, perhaps in those that have metabolic ailments or developing that, whether it preceded it or was a result thereof. And I think that inflammation is something that we need more research to really delineate who would benefit from addressing that, but it doesn't seem like it's everyone. And it extends beyond depression too, because there's inflammatory hypotheses for bipolar disorder too, which, just to define that very quickly, is characterized by episodes of depression, but also episodes of mania or hypomania. So that's elevation in your mood. So there seems to be some sort of an association, but it's not as clear as a one-to-one to say high inflammation causes depression, nor does treating the inflammation resolve the depression. So seems to be a link that goes both ways, but no clear causal factor yet.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, the anti-inflammatory piece is interesting because I'll speak for myself as like an athlete that'll deal with injuries and deal with pain. If I have to take like a meloxicam or something for just my back or something, it does improve my mood. But it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg in this situation? Is like, am I not noticing so much that maybe I was getting a little bit bummed because I was in pain and I wasn't able to do the things that I love as much. So it's like how much of this is like cross feedback with that whole thing too. It's like you take an anti-inflammatory and maybe you're out of pain or maybe you're moving better. And then two things, like one, maybe you're moving better and out of pain. So that just lifts your mood. But B, like maybe people are able to exercise that weren't able to move as much before. And then they're getting that effect, right?
And I think to that point, you bring up a very good example of, in medicine, we've created this divide between mind and body. So we very traditionally look at people as, having mental health issues and having physical health issues. And we operate in these silos, especially as physicians. And you can imagine, you have a psychiatrist, you have an endocrinologist, you have a cardiologist, and we operate in these separate systems. So to the point that you made about, taking a medication to help with back pain, whether it was a direct result of the inflammatory response or it was just like you said, being able to engage in exercise and do the things that you like. I think it's something that we need to appreciate more in medicine as physicians as well, because operating in these silos where we're treating patients with whatever disorder is in our, quote unquote specialty doesn't really treat the whole person and it doesn't take the whole picture into an account. So I think that's where we fall short in medicine too, by hyper specializing and only treating the disorder that's relevant to your condition, because there's so much overlap. And an example would be psychiatric medications can have a lot of metabolic side effects. That can create issues for the endocrinologist, for the cardiologist later on. And if the psychiatrist is more proactive, whether it's lifestyle measures or additional medications to help counteract some of those side effects, it can be a lot better for the patient. It can help the communication between the endocrinologist and cardiologist, and it can prevent downstream outcomes from occurring. So with these metabolic side effects, downstream outcomes that you see sometimes are issues with your heart. So it can be a heart attack, you can have a stroke, there can be vascular issues. But early intervention is what's key for preventing that. So again, whether that's through medications, whether that's through lifestyle parameters, I think it's very important that we work together rather than in these isolated silos, because we don't fully treat the patient in that sense.
Yeah, if you look at especially like some of these depressive tendencies that might come in like waves, for example. Well, first of all, I'll ask a question. Like, so you've got bipolar, you've got depression, obviously two very distinct things. But depression in its isolation, independent of bipolar, does that tend to come in waves still for people? Because you talk to a lot of people that are diagnosed with depression and they still have periods of ups and downs, but they're not necessarily going into mania, right? They're not just like having this hyper overdrive of, uplifted mood and, things like that. It's just like waves of depression. Is that just kind of a cyclical nature of it? Is that pretty common?
Yeah, so it's a good point you make. So for depression, you do see these major depressive episodes. And in between, we stated that people are usually in what we call like a euthymic state, meaning that they're kind of at their baseline. Whether that is, and euthymic is different for each person too. Like your baseline can be different from one person to another. Whereas in bipolar disorder, you are predominantly in episodes of depression. And it's actually a lot harder to treat than it is for someone with a major depressive, like a unipolar depression. But you see these other episodes where, as you mentioned, people experience mania or hypomania. So these can be symptoms where people are having decreased need for sleep. They're only sleeping a few hours per night. They have tons of energy. Their mind is kind of going a million miles a second. They have a bunch of ideas. And then oftentimes that's followed by a crash back into depression. So they're two very distinct entities. The bipolar depression is actually within the medical field a little bit more difficult to treat because of that polarity of mood symptoms changing. But to circle back to your initial question with depression, yes, there are episodes where things seem to be okay, and then it goes back and forth, and it's different for each person. And even without intervention, we know that some of those episodes will resolve. It just takes a little bit longer. And it's, again, different for each person. So we can't predict to say how long this depressive episode is going to last, because it's dependent on so many factors. It's not just the symptoms they're experiencing, but what caused that. Say there was a loss or a breakup or something, and that issue is still going on. You can imagine how that would perpetuate someone's symptoms where maybe someone else just had an episode without a clear trigger.
Yeah, I was going to ask if there's a catalyst a lot of times. Like, in your experience, more often than not with these waves, is there generally a catalyst that triggers a wave more often than not?
Yeah, I would say most often there's some sort of a catalyst that happens that gets someone off of their baseline, and then there's more factors that maybe contribute to keep someone feeling in that depressed state. So that's why when we talk about depression, a lot of the times we focus on the biological side, but I think it's important to break it down to biopsychosocial. And by that I mean, so bio is the biological, psychological, or what factors, how does that person conceive the world around them? Based on how we're brought up, based on our experiences throughout life, we all perceive things different, and an interaction for someone else can be very different for another. And that can lead to a long-lasting impact that can perpetuate some of those depressive symptoms. So that's another thing to take into account. And then the social part is the point that we were speaking about before, where someone may have a job loss, a breakup, stuff like that, that can serve as a precipitant. But really any of these pieces can serve as a precipitant. It can also perpetuate the depressive episode. And it's important to address those, because even within the biological, we spoke more at the kind of inflammation neurotransmitter route, but there are also medical conditions that we know can actually cause depression. So having low thyroid, having low hemoglobin levels, these can actually lead to direct depressive symptoms that can be more easily resolved by addressing the medical condition rather than giving someone an antidepressant, because it's not going to do anything if you have low thyroid. And so that's why it's important as a psychiatrist too, to look into these things. Because you can't, again, going back to the silo example, just say, I am a psychiatrist, I'm going to give you an antidepressant. You're still a doctor. You need to kind of look into some of these medical causes, because that can be a very quick fix for someone that maybe has a causative factor. Again, looking at all of these biopsychosocial realm of things.
I love that you're saying that. Yeah, because it's very interesting you see a lot of people, they just end up on an SSRI, and it's just like, okay, it might help for a period of time, or it might help at a certain time, but then other times it's not doing anything. And there's this other biological piece that people don't really look at, which is, again, it's a great way to talk about sort of the metabolic piece of this, right? Like I think most people that are at least my core audience that's watching this before it gets maybe served out to other people are probably familiar with like Dr. Chris Palmer's work, right? Talking a lot about that. So familiar at least how sort of these backdoor ways of engaging the mitochondria or activating them. Is your work kind of similar in that, with that whole like kind of in that metabolic sphere of brain health, so to speak?
Yeah, so it's kind of reconceptualizing mental illness from the stance of, with Dr. Palmer's work, it's kind of that mitochondrial function that's the fundamental energy producer of the body, and reconceptualizing it from that lens. And I think a lot of my work aligns with that as well too, because by virtue of having interest in lifestyle parameters for mental disorders, whether it's depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, it actually focuses on that more energy perspective. And even things like creatine kind of flow into that as well too. So I think it's very important to have a paradigm shift and to reconceptualize mental disorders in a different way, because I think conceptualizing it from the mitochondrial function and energy is important because it fills that bio side of things, but I think it still doesn't take away from the psychological and social aspects. I think we need to really incorporate all of them together, because again, if we look at them in isolation, we're going to run into problems, because to go all the way back, we're defining depression, right? We've decided to choose what symptoms constitute depression. So you can't really solve something that you've set up, because we've made it this finite disorder, but with 60 million different ways of diagnosing it. So you run into problems at the beginning of the problem that we've created. So I don't think that, we'll ever be able to say one thing is causing depression. We need to look at the full picture, but I think it's very important that we look at different things that could contribute or cause to it, because that's the only way to treat it. And looking at the individual person, their individual symptoms, and their individual experience of depression, rather than just the label, here's your medication sort of thing. It's important to break that down. And I think Dr. Palmer is doing amazing work in terms of tackling that from the more energy perspective.
If we talk about just even the macronutrient perspective there, like obviously he's big proponent of ketogenesis for the brain. Is there relativity there to kind of what we're talking about here? Like not necessarily with ketones as like an alternative energy source or whatever, because the brain is of course like a glucose hog, right? Lots of glucose. But the reason I bring this up is for people with depression, sure, like if there's a mitochondrial dysfunction and you're having a different transport vehicle and essentially able to have ketones get into mitochondria that maybe weren't getting, that makes a lot of sense. But do you see in people with depression, like is there increased glucose demand? Is there increased sort of like brain activity, or is there decreased brain activity? Like what is from what you know, you don't have to have all the solid answers on this, like what does the brain look like energetically in someone that's depressed? Because in theory, it would sound like, well, you just have less energy getting into the brain. But if I'm understanding you correctly, sometimes it might be like one area of the brain being lit up more than other areas of the brain. So it's not necessarily a lack of energy. It's almost like a cattywampus sort of distribution of it.
Yeah, so how I like to conceptualize that is looking at it akin to a state of sleep deprivation. So you can kind of look at it from an increased state of metabolic demand. In a depressed state, you need to essentially put more energy in to get the things done that maybe if you weren't depressed, you would be able to do. So an example would be if you're trying to just even function at work and focus on the task in front of you. Concentration is something that's very heavily affected in depression. So the brain has to work just that much harder to get these things done. And over time, you can imagine if something has to work harder and harder just to function at its baseline, that will eventually not work anymore. And you run into problems. And that's where we see issues with mitochondrial dysfunction and stuff of that. And you can even go down to the level of oxidative phosphorylation, which is how a fancy word for how your body makes ATP or the energy currency. So there's not necessarily a clear brain marker or change in glucose metabolism within the brain for every depressed individual. But how I like to describe it to patients and conceptualize it as a whole is just that increased metabolic demand that's almost akin to being persistently sleep deprived. And again, different for every person. Not every person is going to have these significant energy impairments or sleep impairments, but I think it's a very interesting way to describe it and conceptualize it and for other people to understand as well.
So is this where the kind of interest in creatine for depression really comes in? Is this just kind of helping that up? But you mentioned something, and I know we'll probably do another episode altogether on creatine, so I want to save the meat and potatoes for that. But you mentioned something that was really interesting. You said that in sleep-deprived people, creatine levels actually go up in the brain, right? So you're like seeing this increase, which is really interesting. But then we're also seeing like relatively newer research saying that like creatine for sleep depression, taken exogenously is tremendously beneficial. And then you and I both know Dr. Darren Kandow, who's been on this channel. And we're also seeing it hugely beneficial for depression, anxiety, and some of these other things. Like what is the proposed mechanism there? I know a lot of it needs to be flushed out, but what are you seeing so far?
Yeah, so a lot of this is still needed to be figured out, but we wrote a proposed sort of mechanistic paper on this recently. It was just published in European Neuropsychopharmacology. So alluding to what I mentioned before, looking at depression as this state of increased metabolic demand, so similar to sleep deprivation, we know that at baseline, your body uses the process of oxidative phosphorylation to generate ATP, or the energy currency of the body. But when you're depressed, these processes are essentially not working as they should. So your body's having a difficult time making that energy. Where creatine comes in is it's this alternative, essentially, shunt of energy. So similar to when you're taking it for weightlifting and you have these phosphocreatine stores in your muscle, the thought is that the same thing happens in the brain. So to a lesser extent, because most of the creatine still goes to the muscle, but the thought being that your brain has phosphocreatine reserves that it can then tap into. So in this state of increased metabolic demand where your brain is essentially running out of energy, the creatine offers this kind of quick fix where you can have these energy repletions. And again, this isn't going to cure your depression. Depression is not a creatine deficiency, but the thought is that it can kind of restore some of that energy or bioenergetic abnormalities that are present in the brain in depression, and maybe can allow someone to engage in stuff more. So whether that's therapy, and we'll probably get into this later, but there's been trials to show that creatine improves antidepressant response to therapy, whether that's paired with a medication, and whether that's even with exercise, which surprisingly, there's no trials pairing creatine and exercise for depression yet. But the thought is that it's not this cure-all for depression or mental disorders, but it can kind of help restore the bioenergetic deficiencies that may allow someone progress. Because the big thing in depression is building that momentum. Yeah. It's not about curing it all in one go. That doesn't happen with almost any mental disorder. It's about building that momentum to getting better and allowing someone to engage in more that will allow them to be better. So that's kind of the thought. A lot of work still needs to be done to really confirm different theories and applications and even monotherapy of creatine, which there's no data for yet. But I think it's going to be interesting to see as that comes out, because I think as a substance that has such a favorable risk-benefit profile and it's cheap, accessible, it could be something that could help a lot of people, but we need more data to kind of support that in the future. And I hope to see that come out.
Well, and much of your work has been in the realm of exercise as essentially a treatment for depression and looking at that. So you've probably seen similar sort of things, but I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about what you've seen and what kind of exercise seems to work the most, and like are there certain like sort of titrations with intensity and things like that? Because I think we've all experienced, after a good workout, you feel good, right? But that's not necessarily the lasting effect that we're talking about. There's actually a potential change, and I want to underscore something that you just mentioned. Like even if someone's going on an SSRI or they're going on like this initial like treatment, I mean the goal is, hey, get them to a point where maybe they do want to engage in exercise and establish this habit that can carry them to the next step, right? Not just like a one quick fix for everything. So I mean, it's and I've seen that in a lot of people that are very close to me, right? It's like you got to kind of take this in these little steps. It's like you're just throw it all in at once. It doesn't necessarily work. But what are you seeing when it comes down to exercise in relation to depression? Yeah.
So the first thing that I like to talk about with exercise and depression is oftentimes people have this view that you're either in the lifestyle camp or you're either in the medication and therapy camp. So the first thing before I even talk about exercise for depression is I say that you can use both. They're not these separate camps where you have to use medications and then you can't exercise, or if you're doing therapy, you can't exercise. You can use them all together, and there's actually greater benefits to use all these modalities together rather than in isolation. But when we're talking about exercise for depression, I like to break it down into a prescription similar to a medication, because a lot of the times when people go to their doctor, they're told, go exercise. So whether that's for a mental health reason, whether that's for a physical health reason, it's not very actionable for the person in front of you. And it can even be condescending because the person knows, whether it's depression, whether it's diabetes, that exercise is going to benefit them. What they need you is to help guide them. So when you prescribe a medication, you are telling the patient the dose of the medication, you're telling them the type, you're telling them when to take it, you're telling them if there's a titration schedule, you're going to follow up on their response, whether that's physical or mental health. But when you prescribe exercise, oftentimes people say, again, go exercise. That's akin to saying, take antidepressant.
Yeah.
Not very actionable. You won't know what to take. It's not very safe either for the patient if you were just to say that, because you as the physician are supposed to be that resource to be able to talk about that. So with exercise, we often break it down, and we wrote about this in one of our papers called How to Prescribe Exercise or Physical Activity for Depression. It's called the FIT principle. So FITT. And we'll break down each parameter. So F is frequency. It's how often are you exercising per week. So that can vary from 1 to every single day. The literature is not entirely clear there, but it seems that the greatest benefit is kind of between the 3 to 5 sessions per week. Certainly greater than 3, but I like to emphasize not always going for the ideal. It's, again, building up. So if you start at 1 session every week or 1 session every second week, that's a lot better than 0 sessions ever. So that's an important thing to make that. I is the intensity. You break that up into low, moderate, or vigorous. And an easy way to test intensity, there's so many different complicated ways to measure exercise intensity, whether it's heart rate, all these different responses, is just the talk test. So at a low intensity, you can talk, you can sing, you can do whatever when you're exercising. Moderate, you can probably still talk, but you're not probably going to be able to have enough lung capacity to sing and stuff like that. Whereas vigorous, you're going so hard, you cannot even get a word in. And that's a good way to break that down. And in the general sense, the more intense the exercise, the greater the antidepressant benefits. There are caveats to that. So in older populations, so those 65 and older, usually there's more benefits in the mild to moderate because the vigorous exercise can actually be maybe harmful to them. That can lead to injuries and their body may not be able to sustain that. So, and again, emphasizing you don't have to go from 0 to 100. You don't have to start at 0 exercise to vigorous. Your heart rate is 200 sort of thing. It's building up to that over time and making sure you emphasize that point. The other thing is the timing. So that's how long are your sessions or exercise sessions. And again, the literature isn't clear where there's a clear winner for that, but it's usually between 45 to 60 minutes where it seems that the greatest benefits are. But obviously that's going to vary depending on the exercise you're doing and stuff of that sort. So I'm never straightforward to say you need to do this much exercise to get this much benefit. It's, again, the same approach of building up over time. And then the last T is the type of exercise. So largely, it's broken up into 3 different types. So there's aerobic, which is things like running, resistance, which is weightlifting, and then mind-body, which are things more like yoga and stuff of that sort. And in the meta-analyses, which is when you bring studies together, there's not really a clear winner there either. And I think that speaks to how different these exercise modalities are and how much they actually overlap too. You can imagine a hard weightlifting session can start becoming aerobic in some sense, depending on if you're doing light weights, heavy weights sort of thing. So that's why I don't think there's a clear winner in terms of the type of exercise. The most important thing is that the person is adherent to it. So you want to work with the person in front of you to say, what do you want to do? Or what would be enjoyable for you? Or what could you see yourself fitting into your busy schedule? Because you can prescribe the best literature-based exercise protocol akin to a diet, but if that diet is super expensive, it tastes really bad, not sustainable to make, the person's not going to take it. So what my emphasis is adherence, because I want someone moving rather than not moving. So we make a plan together that will work, that we can then follow up on. So similar to a medication, when they come back and say, this is the FIT principle that I've written in my notes. When we follow up again, we can actually measure, what's your depression at? How did that work for you? Is this intensity sustainable? And we can actually talk about some of those parameters, which is important because that's exactly what we do for medications. So we should be doing the same thing for exercise. So those are some of the general principles that go into what we call as like an exercise prescription. But I think it's important that physicians be aware, and this is beyond psychiatrists, because most of the depression and anxiety is actually seen in the primary care setting. And we know based on the literature, people that exercise themselves, so physicians, are more likely to speak to their patients about that. But I think there is a responsibility, whether you as an individual exercise yourself, to be able to speak to your patients about this as a treatment option, because it is something that can have similar antidepressant effects to medications or therapy. So it's something that you should be able to talk to your patients about, and using that FIT parameter is something that can be helpful to facilitate that discussion.
When we're talking intensity, like if someone is obviously saying like the more intense, the better, but I would imagine like the more intense, the shorter the duration can be, right? Do we have any kind of data on that where it's like, hey, if you're touching zone 5, or if you're, if you're getting to these where you're really able to exert yourself, there's just this cascade of different things that happen, obviously from like exerkines and myokines and all these other like downstream effects that affect our body. And now we're starting to see impact our brain too. Like, is there any sort of scale that you've seen? Like if it's more intense, is it more like 10 minutes, it's 15 minutes? I mean, obviously we have like loose guidelines where it's like, hey, like, 45, 60 minutes is really the sweet spot, but with more intensity, or is it really person dependent? I mean, it comes back down to what they're going to adhere to.
Yeah, it's honestly more so person dependent, because the literature in exercise is so different from one another. When you have a randomized control trial with one intervention of running, walking, or weightlifting, they're so different from one another that we can't have a clear dose-response relationship or say, if your intensity is at X level, then only work out this amount. So right now, we don't have enough granular data to say, if it's this vigorous to have this amount of exercise. It's more person-dependent, which I think makes the most sense too, because some people do like it where you have a very clear plan for them and stuff of that sort. But I think it's also the best approach is just kind of be free-flowing with it, facilitate interest in it, because one of the big things about exercise is, different than medications, is it gives the patient a locus of control. So they feel that they are in control of their body, of their mind. Not to say that they're causing their depression, but that they're now in the driving seat to drive out of that depression. And that itself is very powerful for the patient to say, I'm going to the gym today. This is for my mental health. And I'm seeing those little benefits over time, whether it's their personal benefits or they're checking in with their doctor and seeing it on paper. So I think that's really important. So just to circle back, though, and summarize that, there doesn't seem to be a clear cutoff for intensity and duration and how those interact with one another, more as it's a personalized sort of thing.
This may or may not be in your wheelhouse, but I'm always curious. Have you seen any relationship or know of any work related to like depression and sunlight exposure? I feel like I can just speak for myself, right? Like, just a whole different person when there's sunlight involved. I would imagine, obviously, if you start stacking these things together, like you've got exercise outside. Is there any literature showing that when you're exercising outside, it's even bigger boost? Or?
Yeah, so I don't know about for depression for exercising outside being a better boost, but I do know that there's a handful of studies looking at exercising inside and outside from a cognition perspective, and exercising outside being more beneficial. And by extension, I would imagine that the effects would transfer over to depression, because in isolation, there are also observational or more so cross-sectional studies where we just kind of look at people at a point in time. And people with more sunlight exposure are less likely to develop depression, and as well as a slew of other mental disorders like anxiety, I believe even PTSD. And I think that's a testament to how these lifestyle factors interact with one another. It's hard because some of this data is very confounded with other factors, what impacts someone's sunlight exposure in terms of their job and time off and stuff like that. But again, anecdotally too, I've noticed those benefits too, just going outside. And one interesting point to talk about is beyond just depression or major depression, a large component of people have more of a seasonal affective disorder. So that's kind of under the umbrella of depression. But what that means is during seasons, usually when there's less light, people start entering into more of a depressive state. And the treatment for that is actually using some of these, they call them SAD lights because it's seasonal affective disorder lights. And you can put it on your desk, you can have it where you're working. And they've done studies comparing these SAD lights to antidepressants, and the literature is not entirely clear. Sometimes these SAD lights perform the same as antidepressants, sometimes worse, but I think it speaks to how important light is for mood, both direct effects, but also indirect via sleep, because to regulate your circadian rhythm, it's so important to be exposed to light. So when you wake up in the morning to see the sunlight, and when you go to bed for it to be dark. Whereas if you're just in a room all day with no light exposure, your body doesn't really have a way to figure out what time of day it is, what's going on. And circadian dysfunction is a very important part of mental disorders such as depression, and particularly bipolar disorder too. So it's very important. So sunlight, very important. I don't think there's data to say sunlight plus exercise for depression, but I wouldn't be surprised to see increased benefits if you were to combine the two.
Totally. Now, with exercise, what are you essentially seeing happen in the brain? And I mean that from a sense of like understanding that we can't isolate everything, but is it more metabolic? Is it more cerebral blood flow? Is it, what if you had to sort of say, this is what I think, your opinion, the biggest driving factor is like let's just even say a single bout of exercise, not even necessarily like longer term, because you do get a mood boost. And it's, I mean, I've done enough videos talking, it's like not necessarily endorphins, right? Like endorphins kind of are operating, sure, you might get something out of it, but that's not what's making you feel good for hours afterwards. I mean, if you had to take, if you were to say, okay, in my opinion, what would you say to this?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting way to describe it, and I think for people to understand too, is as you alluded to before, from perceiving your muscles rather than just as muscles to pick up heavy stuff, but more as endocrine tissues. So they have these signaling molecules called myokines, and there's a variety of different things to communicate with your brain. So one of the biggest things that we see is elevations in the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And it's hard to say one-to-one that this is associated with the antidepressant effects, but we know that BDNF is also known as the miracle grow for the brain, and this is so important because depression is essentially an attack on your brain. So it's kind of counteracting that. So that's one of the mechanisms that has been shown in the literature where exercise may have a benefit. And with that too, we know that exercise leads to structural sometimes changes in the brain too. So the hippocampus, or an area that's very important for memory, there's been associations with increased hippocampal volume following exercise, not acutely, like you wouldn't leave the gym with a massive hippocampus after one session, but over time. Yeah. And then some of the neurotransmitters that we talk about within psychiatry too with our medications, so serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, these neurotransmitters, we know over time exercise leads to elevations in them. And then to circle back to our discussion on inflammation, we know that exercise can reduce central and peripheral inflammation too. So whether that's indirectly via comorbid medical conditions like diabetes, or whether that's just for someone that doesn't have any comorbid conditions, but the exercise is benefiting. So I think those are some of the mechanisms that go into the antidepressant effects. But I think it's important, again, to go all the way back and say we actually don't know what causes depression from a biological lens. Yeah. The view is always low serotonin is depression. We know that's not the case now. So it's hard to say what is treating the depression in exercise because we don't know what's actually causing the depression from a biological perspective. But those are some of the mechanisms that interest me, and I like to speak to patients about, especially the myokine angle, because you can almost visualize yourself when you're in the gym or running. Each contraction of that muscle is releasing myokines. It's communicating with your brain. And you can almost feel those changes. And those are those immediate effects that you feel. And I think it's nice for someone to know that because it's like I'm doing something when I'm in the gym or when I'm going for a run or when I'm doing yoga. Something is actually happening to my brain. And I think it's just so important to know.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you're secreting these things that your body's just marinating in, right? And that's like kind of how I visualize it. It's like just like you're marinating in these myokines that are actually doing something. So when we jump real quick to creatine, just so that people have kind of some actionable takeaways, like what are we starting to see is the maybe recommended dose or potential recommended dose for creatine as a even acute or potentially longer term treatment for?
Yeah, so far the literature has largely only used doses of around 5 grams per day, which is very similar to what you see in the fitness industry. There's been a handful of studies looking at 10 grams per day, which is where kind of more of the debate has been around now. In one study, they compared 4 grams to 10 grams per day and looked at the brain levels and actually saw a double of brain levels at that. So that seemed to be some sort of a threshold, but there's not enough data to say where that is. Is it 9? Is it 8? Is it 10 sort of thing? So I think an interesting lens to take from depression, and something that I wrote about in one of my papers, was I'd like to see more trials at 10 grams per day to see where that benefit is, because it's akin to starting an antidepressant, for instance, at a lower dose and saying, I don't see the full effects. Yeah. You wouldn't expect it. And I think we're missing some of those data points to say clearly 10 grams a day is the answer. But I think this is something where it would be very interesting to get more data around. And we're trying to get funding to do a trial comparing or adding creatine 10 grams plus weightlifting for depression. And I don't have the answer for that yet, but that's kind of where my opinion lies, that 10 may be the number and maybe even higher, but it's hard to say right now. Yeah. So I would say most of the trials have used 5, so that's the most heavily evidence-based, but there is a signal for higher dose of around 10. But times will tell, and there are a lot of trials ongoing now, and we'll have better answers hopefully in the coming months or years.
It seems like your demand would make a pretty big difference too, right? You know, I mean, it's just like, yeah, you can take 5 grams, but is that going to be the same for, a 200-pound person that's lifting 4 times per week compared to a 160-pound person that's not lifting at all? Or, like, are you zapping stores and other places? And, I've always messed around with it, kind of using it, fluctuating my dose depending on like what my load is like, or if my cognitive load is higher. I mean, I'm totally just flying by the seat of my pants with it, but it seems to work when I do that, right? And like kind of fluctuating the dose. But well, Nick, where can everyone find you, man?
Yeah, so if I'm the most active on my X or Twitter, but I'm also starting to be more active on my Instagram and eventually my YouTube. It's all the same @, so it's NT Fabiano, Fabiano. on my extra Twitter, I post regular threads breaking down similar scientific studies that we're discussing today. So if that's of interest, I try to respond to people, interact on different papers. So yeah, that's probably my most active place.
Right on, man. Thanks, brother.
Yeah, thank you for having me.